those of you who are with us in the afternoon, wherever you may be. Let me firstly acknowledge that I'm on Dharawal country. It's beautiful outside. I've got a nice bushy backdrop. And I'd like to acknowledge that as the traditional owners of this land and the traditional owners of whatever land that you might be on this afternoon. And pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you for joining us for this webinar this afternoon. It's a difficult topic and you would all be more than well aware of the economic situation that we are in as a country and then more so globally. We heard the latest unemployment figures were 7.1% across Australia. It's the highest that it's been in 19 years. And we know that those figures are going to get worse in the next outlook. We heard about more job losses yesterday. We know there's job losses coming in a whole lot of other sectors. So what we wanted to do with this piece of research that we've partnered with SVA on is to ask, will Australian charities be COVID casualties or partners in recovery going forward? And the other really pertinent question that exists around this is what would happen if we don't invest in our charities, who are the social fabric of our world? And what's the price of social dislocation if we don't? Many of you, and I'm just going to set some where have we come from right now and then pass over to some of my colleagues. Let me acknowledge that Cassandra Goldie is with us from ACOS, and I'm going to be passing to her in a moment. But let me just set some context around where we're at. And for many of you on this webinar, you will well know the situation that charities are at. So please bear with us while I bring others up to speed. Next slide, please, Susie. Because economics is such a focus that we hear all the time, let's just start there and then I'll move to the social piece. We know that our charities are really critical to our economic productivity and our economic world. In fact, the ACNC report found that they employ 1 in 10 of us. There's 1.3 million people employed in our registered charities. They comprise 8% of our GDP and they engage over 3.7 million volunteers. Of those volunteers, back in 2017, Deloitte looked at the hours that those formal volunteers would contribute and estimated that to be worth around $12.8 billion in wages. So they're a very strong economic piece to our country. But we also know that they're really vital to our social fabric. And I like to think of charities as threads in the quilt that is life. And they are the threads that bind us, that connect us, that hold our individuals, our families, our communities much strongly together. They do it when we are well and they do it when we aren't doing very well in terms of stitching us back. And we all know about the important work charities do for the most vulnerable amongst us. But actually our charities are in everything we do. They care for our kids in our playgroups, our daycare, our schools. They care for our aging parents or grandparents or family members. They enable independence and inclusion for people with disabilities. They support the mental health of our teenagers. They educate us. They cure our health problems and try and find new cures for diseases, including they're actively working on COVID right now. There is a whole lot of research to try and solve for our most pressing problems. They rescue our puppies and care for our wildlife. They organise our weekend sport that we participate in and also that we watch for our leisure. They run our museums, our cultural institutions, our art galleries. They are our places for prayer and our points of social connection. Without our charities, our life would not be anywhere near as good as it is. And I don't think we can even begin to try and measure the value of our charities. We know, though, that even before COVID started, many of our charities were at risk. So prior to COVID, we had a situation where if we look over the last few years at the financial statements through the ACNC data, charities' revenue, although it shows growth, we also know that their expenses were growing at a higher rate. What that means is that what we've seen prior to COVID is organisation surpluses or deficits were actually going down as a proportion of their revenue over the last 3 years. And that decreasing net income ratio means that charities were already close to the bone before COVID started. ACOS's survey, and Cass will probably talk about this, showed that even before COVID, charities were reporting that they weren't able to meet the demands that were being asked of them. We know charities have had limited ability to invest in capability building and the infrastructure they need because those margins are so small. And we have also started to see reports of drops in funding and other major tension points during COVID. At this point, I think that's enough of a let me set the scene for where we've come from before COVID, and let me welcome and thank Cass for joining us, and she can fill in the next piece to the puzzle. Thanks, Cass.
Thanks, Christy, and great to be joining so many of you on a Friday afternoon. Can I acknowledge elders and pay respects to First Nations people all over Australia. I have the privilege of sitting on Gadigal land this afternoon and pay respects to elders past and present. What you're joining us for this afternoon is a really vital piece of research that's been done as a partnership between CSI and SVA, and demonstrating again the great spirit of collaboration that is at the core so often of what makes us a good country, and really what makes for great charitable responses and the vital role of community services. There is no question that our country and the world has been and continues to face some extraordinary challenges, some that were entirely present before the COVID-19 hit us, and now of course we are seeing right now the great uncertainties that continue to unfold about the health, social and economic crisis that this particular virus has unleashed upon us as a community. Vital community services, no question about it. So many people in the community rely at some point in time. In fact, it would be very few of us who are untouched by the need and the value that comes from having a place where you can get support, where you have somebody to work with you when you are facing your own personal, family or community challenges. Around us right now, there are some big debates about what needs to be done next. People are very worried about the social and economic conditions for Australia, and we are right to be very alert to what our job is to advocate to push forward with the right responses. So a couple of areas I'd really love to highlight and to open for discussion further this afternoon with those of you who are on the webinar with us. Of course, right now the government is considering its role and where it should be providing financial support further. The reality is, for many charities, you are working with people on very low incomes. There's no question that as a community, now is the time for us to lift up our voice and push for that vital job seeker payment, which prior to COVID-19 responses was one of the lowest in the OECD at a brutal $40 a day. The government absolutely did the right thing by doubling the rate of job seeker, and the latest survey that we did about what's happened for people who were on $30 a day before and now have some extra dollars, the impact has been profound in terms of over 90% of people being able to buy fresh fruit and vegetables, for example, in a way that they weren't able to before. So as a charitable sector, we have come together to call for some of this vital investment, and we will persist with that for people directly, the assistance that people need. The reality, of course, will be, though, for many people, it is both about financial relief and support, but also having services and supports that might be needed for you. For example, to be able to get back into paid employment, to respond to mental health, all the areas that have been highlighted already. The government, its response in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the charitable sector with the delivery of JobKeeper was absolutely welcome. It really has, whilst it hasn't been comprehensive, there's no question that there are big gaps in that. JobKeeper has been a vital part of helping to secure short-term financial sustainability and jobs in this vital area of the Australian community. But of course, everybody is very concerned about what might happen. once JobKeeper is withdrawn. And I'm sure we'll talk further about that this afternoon. But ACOS is right now wanting to hear from you. We have a very strong view that we need to ensure that we do not end JobKeeper with no alternative financial support in place for the community and charitable sector. As you will hear, with the kind of work, the research work that's being presented this afternoon, if we predict what might happen in terms of drops of revenue, we will not have the services that were so vital in helping us to get through some of the crises that we've seen earlier this year. And worse than that, we will certainly not be in a position to respond to the increased need that we know will be out there and potentially for a very long time. There are a combination of factors here that make the sustainability of services particularly challenged. The increase in demand that we predict, we know is out there now and will only grow, we predict. The drop in alternative sources of revenue, donations, the philanthropic community, people being asked a lot to help, but how long can we secure that kind of income? What will happen there? We've got some really important detail to be heard this afternoon. And then, of course, the concern that we've got that we will have significant job losses, which will have its own flow-on effect. I just want to highlight for a moment having the great privilege of spending so many time with people who I can see on this screen, and many of you I can't see, and spent so many hours with people who work in this sector, highly feminised, over 80% workforce, many on very low or modest incomes. This is a workforce you invest in people in this sector, we will go the extra mile. The economics say that. Every dollar into this sector goes well and truly beyond. This is not a spend on the budget. This is an investment in our future. The last thing we would want to see is the kind of job losses that are potentially facing us here. We've already had a very gendered analysis to what's going on in terms of job losses already, with women particularly affected. You'll hear more about that this afternoon, and we certainly hope that we've got people in this webinar who are very keen to work with all of us in making sure that governments hear the findings, hear the reality of what we could be facing here, and understand how important it will be to work in partnership with the community sector and charitable sector on the solutions. Look, just before I wind up for now, I want to highlight, from the beginning of COVID-19, we urged governments to work in partnership with the community and charitable sector, and particularly with those representing people who are most vulnerable to the health crisis. You know, Australia was lauded around the world because of the way that it responded to the HIV crisis. It was because it invested in community-led and charitable responses, and for the long haul. As we watch what's happening with the potential ongoing impacts of this virus, many community leaders have said you have to invest in the community services and charitable sector for us as community to help lead us as partners in recovery. So I hope that's the conclusion to that question that's being posed for this seminar this afternoon. And I really look forward to hearing the discussion and working on some of the solutions together. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Cassandra. Great to have you with us. And Cass will still be here at the end for any questions and to close. I'm going to give you the snapshot of the findings. This doesn't mean you're allowed to then log off the webinar. I will then pass to my colleague, Susie Riddell, CEO from SVA, who's going to go through the findings in a little bit more depth. I also just wanted to acknowledge all of the fantastic work that SVA team members and CSI team members have done to pull this report together. Susie and I are doing a lot of the presenting. Cassie McGannon is with us and we'll be doing some of the Q&A when we get to the hairy questions that Susie and I can't answer. Thanks, Cass. So in snapshot, what we did was look at what happens if we modelled a drop in revenue for our charities who have paid employees. What would happen if we had a drop in revenue of 20% across the sector using the 2018 ACNC data, the Charities report through their AIS, Australian Information Statements. The summary findings, and again, Susie will tease these out some more, is that we would be looking at, if the 20% drop occurred and we didn't have things like the supplements like JobKeeper in place, we would be looking at 9 in 10 charities immediately making an operating loss. We would be looking at over 1 in 6 being at high risk of having to close their doors within 6 months because they have so few reserves to keep themselves going. And we've also estimated that at risk would be over 200,000 jobs. Obviously, this has really significant implications for what this means for our charities in regard to what services they might be able to provide at a time, like Cass said, when we're seeing increased demand on their services. And it also has really serious economic implications around what it means for the sector, not just at not being able to meet demands, but we're also particularly worried about what is the cost of not doing business. So the cost of social dislocation and that October cliff looming is not just what we've outlined thus far, but also, even if I just take 3 areas really quickly, the cost of not early intervening, the cost of us not addressing social issues is really significant. So Australia currently spends $15.2 billion every year because our kids and young people experience serious issues that require crisis intervention. We know homelessness is really expensive per person. We know that educational inequity costs us in terms of our GDP. So the economic implications of this are vast and wide and are quite significant. So in summary, the 6 recommendations that we have come up with, before I hand back to Susie, is extending JobKeeper. We're calling on government, and Patrick can talk in the Q&A section more about how we've reached out to various departments. We're calling on government to extend JobKeeper to be a ramp and not that cliff edge for charities. We are calling on retaining JobSeeker at a higher level, which Cass has already pointed out is really important in terms of what that means for people's economic, social and health lives. We're calling on governments to set up a Charities Transformation Fund. This is really consistent with and could be coupled with the work that Philanthropy Australia and others have been doing around this. Similarly, we are joining the calls of the likes of Philanthropy Australia and many others around simplifying fundraising and philanthropy to encourage increased giving. We're also calling on keeping funding for services that reflects the actual costs and demands of those services. And we know that some of those services are currently undercosted, and we also support the call that is currently out there around asking governments to extend contracts beyond financial years where we know there is a continuing need for those services. And finally, there is still much that we do not know that we need to know, and many questions we need to answer. And the key here is, how do we build back better and create the kind of society that we want? And we need to do more research in looking into what that might be. So that's a quick summary. Let me pass to Susie, who's going to unpack some of the research findings in a little bit more detail for us. Thanks, Susie.
Thank you very much, Christy, and thanks, Cass, as well, for all of that scene setting. I am joining you from Gadigal land as part of the Eora Nation, and would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm joining from today, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I noticed a couple of people trying to scribble down notes. There is obviously all of this information in the full report, but we're also very happy to share this slide pack with people. So we'll put our contact details in the chat and share the slides with anyone who's interested as well. So I'm going to take you through how we developed the report. But before I do, the reason why we developed it is because CSI, SCA and many on this webinar today have been so worried about the impact of COVID, both the health crisis and demand for services and the economic crisis on our charities, and whether we can see those charities be partners in recovery or whether they will too be COVID casualties. And so we wanted to add some data into the conversation so that we could strengthen the calls for action that Christy just summarised. And so this is desktop analysis that I'll take you through how we reached these conclusions. You'll see it doesn't answer all the questions. If you have other data sets, one of the things we'd love to do next as part of number 6 for the research is what other questions might we be able to answer with access to further data sets, what's really happening for charities experiencing the COVID crisis. So our approach to start with is we took data from the most recent complete year from the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission annual information statements. So there's around 57,000 charities, registered charities in Australia. We looked at the 16,000 charities who employ at least 0.8 of a full-time equivalent person. And that's because we really wanted to look at the impact of JobKeeper, which is tied to having employees. And we also didn't include the very small ones. And so while that's only about a third of the ACNC data in terms of number of charities, it represents 94% of the workforce. Small charities that are run largely by volunteers are incredibly vital, as Christy just outlined, to the fabric of society, but weren't the focus of this particular analysis. So we took our 2018 year as our baseline of what was happening to charities before COVID. And then we modelled a crisis scenario. And the scenario we modelled is a 20% drop in income across all sources. ACOS and our community both collected survey data in the early weeks of the COVID crisis to try to understand what the drop in revenues has been for the charity sector. It obviously varies widely depending on the nature of the organisation and its normal income sources. But we felt that 20% was a reasonably conservative assumption based on the survey data that was coming out at the beginning of the crisis. Then we also modelled what happens if you add back JobKeeper. So JobKeeper eligibility based on $1,500 per employee per fortnight, and we applied that to 80% of the charities in our analysis. Not all charities participated and not all employees would be eligible. We didn't have data on how many were actually accessing JobKeeper, and so both the 20% income drop and the 80% application were assumptions that we made. And I'll take you through the key measures of the financial measures that we looked at as we go through the method. So the starting point is, well, what does 2018 look like? This is the breakdown of the net income ratio of charities in 2018 in our analysis, so the 16,000 that employ people. And the most common financial scenario is making a small surplus. So a quarter of our charities making between 0 and 5% surplus. Christy talked about the tough situation many charities find themselves in. When we look back in time, the net income ratio of charities in the ACNC data sample has been shrinking. So back in 2016, the net income ratio of these charities was 8.9%. It went down in 2017 to 8.5%. By 2018, it was down to 6.3%. And for our charities in this sample who employ people, it's only 4.9%. So a pretty lean financial position to be in before you're entering a crisis. And that's driven by a lot of factors, including small margins that are shrinking from government contracts, pressure from philanthropic donors, increased costs to operate and to comply with regulation, to name just a few. So where do our charities get their income from? On the left-hand side, you'll see that all charities, all 15,000 charities in the data sample, and you'll see that that's actually quite similar in terms of income sources to the 16,000 in our analysis. About half the income comes directly from government, around a third from the sale of goods and services. Donations and bequests is smaller, 5% for our charities. Although really important to note, and I know from the list there's a lot of philanthropists on this webinar, philanthropic donations are often some of the most flexible sources of funding that allow charities to deliver higher quality and also give them the ability to be really innovative and invest for the future and better outcomes against the impact they're trying to have. That sale of goods and services in many cases was really impacted by COVID when there were restrictions on operations of, for example, social enterprises. The sale of goods and services also includes some indirect income from government, where government funds an individual who then purchases a service from a charity. So now we come to what we've modelled. On the left-hand side is the net operating positions and performance of the charities in 2018, and we classified them into 3 groups. Your green and called surviving if you were making a net operating surplus, even if it was a very small one. So about 2/3 were surviving. The blue is vulnerable. You're making a net operating loss, but you've got net current assets to cover at least 6 months of making a loss. So there's some reserves there to allow you to make a loss for a while and still be able to be viable. And that orange group is high risk. This is an organisation that's making a net operating loss and also doesn't have net current assets to cover 6 months of deficits. So really vulnerable position to be in. If they don't make any more changes, then they're at really serious risk of not being able to continue. So when we modelled a 20% drop in income, you see a pretty dramatic picture on the right-hand side. 88% of our charities are now making a loss. And we see that 6% of high-risk charities now is 17%, 1 in 6 charities who would be making a loss and don't have the reserves to cover 6 months of those losses. So pretty problematic when nearly 90% of our charities would be making an operating loss immediately. What we've then done is model what we call our survival curve, which is, well, what happens to those charities if that's their reality? The top black line is how many charities are surviving month on month in the baseline. So there were some charities that, because they were at very high risk, would have been at risk of closing down, a gradual decline in the number of charities based on financial performance and position. But in the crisis, you can see it's really dramatic. More than a quarter of our charities could become financially unviable within a year if they didn't make any further changes, because they'd be running deficits as a result of a significant drop in income. So then the good news, obviously, as Cass and Christy talked about, is when JobKeeper was announced and we modelled what happened to charities that employ people. And so here's that picture again of that classification of 3 different groups, the same baseline on the left, that model of the crisis, and then now on the right, what happens when you put JobKeeper for 80% of the employees in our analysis. And the good news is nearly half of our charities are back to making an operating surplus, and that really high risk category of 9% is obviously much smaller. But it's still worrying that even with JobKeeper, 53% of charities would be making a net operating loss. So it certainly isn't repairing charities back to the position that they were in before the COVID crisis happened. And what you'll see with the survival curve that I'll show you is it's only temporary. So here we show again that baseline of 2018, what was going to happen anyway, the terrible crisis of organisations not being able to continue if they didn't make changes. And the green with JobKeeper shows that for 6 months, JobKeeper actually really makes a big difference to those charities, and a lot are now able to continue being financially viable through that 6 months of the crisis. But as soon as JobKeeper ends, after 6 months, the curve looks the same, and we see a dramatic fall off of organisations becoming financially unviable pretty quickly. Now we turn to looking at jobs. So everything I've shared with you so far is number of organisations. Now we look at number of employees. And so on the left-hand side, our baseline shows, well, where were people employed? And 75% of the people employed in these 16,000 charities were in a charity that was making a small operating surplus. And only 3% of our employees were in organisations that were at very high risk. So even though it's fragile, the majority of people are in an organisation that's surviving. When you model the crisis based on where our people are, it's even more sobering, the numbers, than what I showed you before. Now 97% of people employed in the charity sector are employed in an organisation that's making an operating loss, and 1 in 5 are employed in a charity that's making an operating loss and couldn't survive 6 months of deficits given their financial reserves. So pretty catastrophic results if 20% income drop was seen across all of these charities. And when we apply JobKeeper on the right-hand side, it does still make a big difference. We've now got over a third of people in organisations that are back to being surviving. They're making a net operating surplus, but it's still 63% of people in organisations that are making a loss. So if you're an employee in this sector, you're probably quite worried about the financial outlook for the organisation that you're in, given that this is a temporary support and it's still only helping just over a third of organisations to stay in that operating surplus position. And so what might that mean? You are an audience who know the not-for-profit sector very well, many of you, and you'll know that one of the challenges for charities is that they can't raise equity like a commercial business could, and many of them are not fit for purpose for debt either. And so the only options that you've got really are to cut costs, and cutting costs means cutting services and cutting jobs. So on the left-hand side of this graph, we show how many people are in our data analysis set, which is 1.2 million employees. The middle column looks at, well, what if every organisation just cut 20% of jobs in line with a 20% drop in revenue? So evenly cutting everywhere, and that's about 245,000 jobs. The right-hand side is a different angle. That's looking at, well, what about the employees who are in those at-risk charities, the ones who are making a net operating loss and don't have 6 months of net current assets to cover the losses? If all of those cut all their jobs, then that would be 260,000. So we're pretty worried that the combination is the reality that we would imagine we would see, which is many organisations making some cuts and some organisations ceasing to exist. And overall, over 200,000 jobs at risk. And what Cass pointed out is what a lot of organisations are really worried about, which is if this happened, not only would organisations not be able to provide the services that they are already providing, which are vital services to the community, but they'd have fewer services to meet increased demand, and they're adding to the unemployment challenges of Australia rather than being partners in recovery. And so all of this is really looming in terms of the time to make decisions and the time at which this all might get a lot worse. And we're talking about an October cliff because charity leaders and decision makers are worried that JobKeeper payments are slated to end at the end of September, and we really welcome the fact that the Commonwealth Government is reviewing what might happen to JobKeeper at the moment, and at the same time as a number of other support. So the job seeker supplement that Cass talked about so eloquently, we just can't go back to $40 a day, or we will see a huge spike in demand for many charitable services. The lease and loan deferrals that were announced by governments are also temporary and stop at the same time. And we're also going to be seeing a Commonwealth budget handed down in October, and a lot of charity leaders really worried about what a rapid return to budget repair could mean for their future contracts. And so just to revisit the recommendations that Christy talked about, and then we'll open up to questions and discussions. Charities are different to other organisations in Australia because of the vital services that they provide, because of the financial positions that they're in, and because they have so few levers, financial levers, with which to ride out a crisis. And for those reasons, we want to see JobKeeper not end as a sudden cliff, but be a ramp where we get targeted support over time for the charities that need it. Transitioning to the new normal is not going to be that easy for all charities. They've got creativity and innovation in spades. Most of them know what they could do to have greater impact. But without financial means and skill and capability to bring that to life, many of them won't have the transformation resources to be able to transition to the new normal. So this would include things like digital transformation. Only just under half of organisations surveyed at the end of last year by Info Exchange, who were charities, were even on the cloud. So a lot of charities have been constrained in the use of digital technology because it costs a lot of money, takes time, and you need a lot of skill to be able to implement things like that. So digital is really important, but also the opportunity to see more collaborations where organisations are trying to achieve a common purpose, further monitoring and evaluation to see what's really working, etc. It totally echoed both what Christy and Cass were saying about we really need governments to commit to funding organisations that they're already funding so we can have certainty for these services. And where there's an increase in demand, or an increase in the costs because of COVID, that governments increase their funding to reflect that increase in cost or increase in demand. Keeping JobSeeker higher is about making sure we don't add to the demand that the charities sector will be potentially facing, and also because we know that providing extra income support to those in the lowest income brackets is a really effective economic stimulus for economic recovery and things like consumer spending, not to mention all of the pieces around human dignity and the right thing to do. Absolutely echo calls from lots of different parties about simplifying fundraising. We've been horrified to hear how complex it is for some organisations who used to fundraise in person at events or with appeals like door knock appeals. To try and pivot and do online fundraising is actually unnecessarily complex, and simplifying fundraising regulation could make it a lot easier and simpler for charities to quickly pivot to take advantage of fundraising online, and also looking at incentives to encourage donations from individual taxpayers as well as foundations and corporates and other bodies. We saw in the GFC, for example, that at that point in time, individual taxpayer donations went down 20%. And if you look at the commentary, we're expecting that this downturn is going to be pretty significant in comparison to the GFC. So the JB Ware report that we looked at, and many of you will be really familiar with, predicting between this year and next financial year a 20% drop in philanthropy is obviously really worrying for the 70% of charities in Australia that rely in some way on philanthropic donations. And if you haven't already seen this research and this was your first whistle stop tour, you probably got a lot of questions that we didn't answer, and that's part of why we need support for further research so that we can better understand what the real impact of the crisis has been on charities and how it differs. We know it differs depending on the sector you're in, your operating model, the types of government supports that might have been given, the size, and the type of people or objectives that you're trying to achieve. So there's certainly a call for further research, and to that end we absolutely invite people to share where you're doing research. It will help those who are advocating on behalf of the charity sector if we've got really strong data to back up the calls for action, and if we're all singing from the same song sheet, then the people who are making decisions will be hearing it from every angle. So that's part of why we're so pleased to be partnering with the Centre for Social Impact on this and be working in collaboration with ACOS, with UCAS, with the Community Council for Australia, Philanthropy Australia, lots of foundations. We're here to be collaborative and to work collectively. So that's the Whistle Stop Tour. We are now going to, I'll hand back to Christy to provide just one kind of little wrap up, and then we're going to be taking questions, and Patrick from my team has been monitoring the chat. Now's your opportunity to add more questions, and we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Susie. Look, I think that we're probably preaching to the converted on this call. Everybody knows how important charities are, and we want them to be partners in recovery. There have been some questions that have come through. We were going to get, what we might do is go to some of those questions now, and then Cass Gouldy and I can do a wrap at the end. Might actually work well. Thanks Susie, and thanks for a great whistle stop deep dive into the report. But the report has been shared on the, you can see that on the chat function. You can see the various links where you can find more details on this report, and some other links have been provided. Patrick from SVA can start to answer some of those policy government questions that have started to get into the chat, and then he's going to moderate the Q&A for us. Thanks, Patrick. Over to Patrick Flynn. Welcome.
Thanks, Christy. And so what I'll do is please keep posting the questions in the chat, and we'll endeavour to go through as many of those if we can. There were a couple of questions that were also posted earlier, and a couple of people have also responded to those, so we might add to those. But I might just, I might start with one of the earlier questions, which is actually an important one. I think it's at a kind of a higher level. And Susie, I'll throw this one to you firstly, but I'm sure Christy and Cass will probably also have some comments, which is about what actually happens at the end of the financial year 21. And obviously there are implications for that. Both the question was really about what happens when government contracts come up for renewal and what's going to happen at the end of that financial year. But I think it's also useful to comment about, as you know, charities have particular financial cycles that they go through, including in their fundraising revenue. So what do we think is going to happen at the end of FY21?
Thanks, Patrick, and a great question that certainly we as an organisation at SBA are really living at the moment is how do you plan for the next financial year when there is such great uncertainty? And that uncertainty comes in many forms. There's government contracts that we don't know whether they will be extended, and that there hasn't been clear communication yet to stakeholders about what that process may be. I know a lot of organisations are hopeful that they will, at a bare minimum, see rollovers where they won't have to go through the process of tenders and applications, and we'll at least have some temporary extensions. We know that there are not-for-profit organisations in all sorts of sectors who are not making plans to take on further risk because they can't see line of sight to what will happen with their government funding sources. And so that means not starting your innovative project that might have more impact, not hiring the extra staff members who you know will make a big difference to your service delivery, not trying to go for that new collaboration that would take several years to pull off and have significant impact. And where organisations rely on philanthropy, and we are one of those organisations, because of the cycle, as you described, Patrick, of normally getting a really big chunk of your philanthropy at the end of the financial year, a lot of charities take on a lot of risk each financial year in their budgets, where we incur expenses pretty evenly across the year because most of our expenses, let's be honest, are salaries. And then at the end of the year, we hope that we raise enough philanthropy to call it even, call it a year square or close to square. And that's the kind of roulette that many charities play who rely on philanthropy. When JB Ware is predicting that between this year and next year we'll go down by 20% in philanthropy, I think that's going to mean very conservative planning from not-for-profit organisations who simply just can't afford to take the risk because they don't have the financial reserves to cover the losses if their philanthropy doesn't come through at the end of the year. And so even though it hasn't happened yet, I think a prudent response at an individual charity level is going to be a lot of charities shrinking and not taking on that risk because they are just not prepared to take that financial bet without line of sight to what's going to happen. So I'd be interested if there's others on the webinar who have experience of that, but that's what we're expecting. And we won't have to wait until the end of JobKeeper and the end of JobSeeker, etc., to see those decisions being made. They're being made now on the basis that we're about to start a new financial year, and cuts to services and cuts to jobs are going to be happening already.
Thanks, Susie. I was just actually going to, Cass, I might pass to you next on this one, and then Christy, I'll come to you after that. But Cass, I know that changes to government contracts has been something that ACOS has been talking to the government about directly, and that was what the questioner was asking about, particularly was about what happens with that. Obviously, big implications for philanthropy, but on the government contract side, what's the latest in terms of what your expectations are and what you're asking government to do to ensure that people can make those long-term plans where their government income at least can be a little more certain? Oh, we've lost you, Cass. You don't look like you're on mute, but I'm not sure whether or not you've turned your microphone off or we've lost you in the process. Sorry. I'm not sure hopefully one of our tech people might be able to help out with that one. Sorry, Cass, but I might try and come back to you on that one in a second. Christy, really interested in your thoughts too, in terms of the planning over the cycle and what that means for charities. CSI has obviously done analysis of charities data over many years now, having had the contract to do the work with the ACNC in the past. I'm really interested to know what your thoughts are about how charities are going to be planning through that financial cycle.
It's a really tricky one, and somebody's put a question in there around, how does this differ for different organisations within different sectors? And as Susie sort of landed at the end of the presentation, the financial implications for different charities will be different based on the types of services you provide, the kinds of overhead costs that you have. We know the costs of compliance and regulation and quality control and all of those things have gone up. And often charities really struggle to find the money to pay for it. There's the cost of, I could go on. And there's an interesting even piece on the ACNC website that talks about why charities need reserves. And it's obvious to all of us that are trying to balance the books in charities. But in terms of the public perception, I think that this is really part of the important cultural message. So we've got a technical problem around how do you balance the books. And then we've also got a cultural problem where charities are constantly being asked to justify how and where they're spending the money. And the cultural piece, I think, is important because, we saw in the bushfires the issue around the likes of the Red Cross and others being criticised around how that funding was expended. And part of the, the popular culture response is I want all of the money to go into to go direct to the beneficiary. And the real challenge for us as a society is we need to shift the way that people think about that, because actually you've got people caring for your kids. You want to make sure that there's child protection processes in place. You want to make sure that the mentors are being appropriately trained. You want to make sure that the aged care providers are treating people with dignity and respect, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we have a cultural shift problem that we need to deal with that was here before COVID, and I think we're going to see increasingly because there's so much focus on the money. And then to get back to that cycle piece, we have consistently seen on average around 40% of charities funding comes from government, and then depending on the charity type will depend on where the other slices of the pie come from. And so that's been fairly consistent in the past. Government is going to increasingly play a potentially a more important role if we see some of those other funding services fall down, and if we can ensure that those services and what charities are doing are maintained. I think the other thing that, just on the philanthropic note, that's worth saying around 2021, I think one of the worries for 2021 is that there have been some philanthropic responses that have been amazing in the COVID crisis moment and saying, okay, what do you need to keep your lights on? But actually there is some great fear, and I'd be interested in the people on the chat to see if this resonates. But we have heard there are issues around, well, what does this mean for philanthropic dollars for 2021? And how do we make sure that there is adequate income that's going to be coming in during that time, particularly when we're seeing those philanthropic funds also lose funding in terms of their own investments. So this could have a very long trajectory. And Cass is back now too, I just noted.
Thanks, Christy. Cass, we might see if we can, whether it's going to work or not. It doesn't look like it. Okay. Cass has, if you're watching the chat though, she has put some details into the chat about some of the work that ACOS is doing on this issue. And I guess what I'd flag with you, and not being able to hear her, I hope she's not going to be horrified with what I'll say on behalf of ACOS's behalf. But what I would say to you is that ACOS has been looking, obviously the community sector is a particular subset of the overall charity sector, but that but ACOS has been looking quite carefully at what the different contracts are that are coming up for renegotiation, and has made representations to the government around things that were up for renewal there being some rollover, and where there were things that were likely to come up for large tenders or changes to and reforms, that there's some consideration given to halt those processes for a period of time. But what it does also mean is that, as the questioner alluded, that it could mean that some of these things, those things are still going to come back. at some point, and it could mean that we actually have a flurry of activity around tenders and contract rollovers even in 12 months' time. One of the other common questions that is being asked, and I'll put this one back to Susie, it's a question we've got asked a lot, is just about do we know more about what the risks are for different parts of the charity sector? Oh. Sorry, I think that's may have just been Cass trying to see if we can get another audio line working. But Susie, I know it's a question that we've got asked by a lot of people, but one of the good things about having released this a couple of weeks ago now is we've also spoken to quite a number of different people about the different experiences. And it would be good just to hear a little bit about why we've done this at the charities level, why it's at the macro level, but also what we're starting to hear from different sectors.
Thanks, Patrick. We chose to do the analysis at the entire charities level for the ones that employ at least 0.8 of a full-time equivalent, and only at that level, rather than being deep dive into sectors, geographies. For pragmatic reasons, we wanted to be able to get it done quite quickly so that we could put it in front of makers like ministers and Nev Power's COVID Commission, for example. So there was a pragmatic element to it, but there's also a reason around data quality. So I don't know how familiar most people are with the ACNC data set, but once you start trying to slice and dice, we do end up with some challenges around data quality. So when I know people are really interested in, well, what does it mean for a particular subsector, homelessness or disability, or the arts, for example, what does it mean for a geography? It's quite hard to answer those questions with confidence because there's so much variability in the quality of the data. Whereas when we looked at the top level, we feel like these trends are representative because they are for the entire sector. What we are seeing as we talk to more groups of stakeholders is there's an appetite to match data sets and to see if we can use similar approaches with data sets that already exist, that are understood well. And so, for example, that might be geographic, it might be a subsector. So if you have any access to those kinds of data sets, that would be an area that we're really interested in going into further. And I think we really wanted to provide a point of cohesion. That's probably just the last thing I'll say about that, and have us all as charities talking about the same sets of supports as an umbrella to then the specific sets of supports that might be required for subsectors or particular types of organisations.
Thanks, Susie. And as I said, one of the things that has been a really positive thing for us out of this releasing the data has been that we've been approached by lots of different people in different sectors to try to get a better understanding of how this might apply to them. And so clearly there are different things happening in the arts sector to what there are happening and to what's happening in the environmental sector. There are different things happening in disability. There are also some subsectors where we've actually seen increases in their revenue. So there are, for instance, some food support charities which have seen increases in their revenues as a great thing because some governments have actually made some investments in those areas. There's been some specific investments into mental health is another area where we've seen that there has been some government support for particular sectors or subsectors within the broader charity sector. Which have obviously changed the dynamics in those individual pieces. And even in some of those bigger picture pieces like childcare, for example, there are not-for-profits and charities that are operating in the early learning space. And obviously there's a particular package for those groups. So it is very different from one to another. I'm just going to answer one other question quickly that is probably a question I would have answered myself anyway, which is I know a number of people are interested to know about what sort of reception we've got from government. And what I guess I would share with you is that we've been quite deliberately and quite proactively have been presenting the findings to the Commonwealth Government, but we've also had some engagement with some state governments about the findings. We've also spoken federally to the opposition as well. And as Susie indicated, we've certainly been putting in the report into some of the inquiries that are running at the moment because the Senate is also running an inquiry and there are obviously inquiries going on about the future of JobKeeper. I guess what I would say to you in terms of the response, which was also one of the questions in terms of what response have we got from government, is that I think that it's, we've got a good hearing from government, and I think including different parts of government. We've also submitted it to a number of departments, and that people are very interested in the results of the modelling and what that might mean. And I think that, people have been willing to listen. I wouldn't pretend for a second that we have commitments on all of the different 6 sets of recommendations, but I think that that they've certainly been looked at. We were obviously very pleased, as ACOS was, that there seems to be some intimations that JobSeeker won't go back down to the level of New Start, but clearly there's a lot more that we want to see yet on that particular announcement. I think we've had a positive response in the recognition that JobKeeper is an important part of the solution for lots of charities at the moment, and that's been acknowledged. The question is what happens next. And I think it just to draw another one of the 6 recommendations, certainly around having a nationally consistent framework for fundraising and the fundraising laws between Commonwealth and states. To be honest, my sense from our conversations with governments has been that everybody recognises that that's a problem. It's quite a delicate piece of legislative work in order to either align or change fundraising rules at different layers of government. And so I suspect it's been lack of bandwidth and to some extent lack of will to push some of those things through, rather than there being any particular objection to wanting to do that. But I think that there is potentially opportunity at the moment through the National Cabinet and through some of the mechanisms that have been set up to advance some of those. So that's some of the pieces on the reaction that we've got to government. Cass, I might try and go back to you and see whether we can get this to work. Third time's the charm.
So I'm on video on one channel and on audio on another channel. So I think we're okay. Can I check you can hear me now? Okay, excellent. So first of all, on the key messages, I think that I would encourage those who are engaging with governments about the case for greater investment at this time into charities and services. I think, of course, the question that's being asked is about the size of the potential deficits overall for the country. And one of the things that the economists have been very clear in saying to government is that particularly with the low interest rate environment that we've got, and the fact that the Reserve Bank monetary policy can do nothing with this recovery, unlike previous downturns and recessions, it all has to be fiscal policy, in other words, government expenditure. That the main message from, for example, Chris Richardson and others is if the government invests to provide jobs-rich growth, economic growth, the deficit will essentially over the long term look after itself. So in fact, that we need to learn lessons from the last GFC, where what happened, you'll all remember it, was we had a sort of a stimulus package, and then successive governments came in to cut, and they primarily cut from 2 places: social security and social services. That's essentially where all the big billions came out. That was the mistake, and that's why the economy was flagging even before COVID, because the engine room in the economy is real money flowing, demand, consumer confidence. These are different lines for different audiences, but it's all very important. These are not messages. This is real facts, that the money that's going into the hand of this workforce, the people that we all really care about in terms of jobs, people, it's very jobs rich, money into the community or charitable sector. As you said, it all goes into wages. Susie, I think you said that's great right now, because that's money into people's hands where they are spending it in the real economy. Low and middle income people spend everything because you don't have much discretion about saving. But in the other message about why now we want government to give certainty is because we're aware, as these reports come out, when we're talking about job losses of maybe $200,000, everybody's very conscious in our workforces. People are going, gee, you know what? Maybe I won't spend. Maybe I'm going to tighten my budget belt even more because I'm really worried whether I'll actually have a job. Nobody said I don't have a job, but I'm worried about whether everybody. You'd be crazy not to be worried right now. And so we're saying to government, you have to give, everybody's talking about consumer confidence, give confidence. So as Patrick referred to earlier, we are definitely pushing the government to firstly extend contracts wherever they possibly can, and rapidly to do that. If you are having trouble with a particular contract manager, don't have to dob that person in, but let us know. We've got ACOS, for example, we have a meeting with Minister Ruston next Thursday. I would really like to hear whether you are having trouble with that at your program level. If you're in a particular contract discussion, as a for example, we're contracting ending to March next year, we need it extended. I need to hear that. And secondly, we're urging the governments, wherever possible, to remove strict work plans or restrictions on the way you're allowed to spend your money in these contracting. The irony is government funding is the most secure at the moment, actually. And we need to give as much flexibility for organisations to manage their risk, the risk that Susie was talking about, you know, being able to spread, to be where you need to be, and for government to come back. So again, if you're having trouble with flexibility, we would really like to know that. We think at the ministerial level, including from Matthias Cormann, they get that, but flowing it through, right through all the programs and people within the public sector can be challenging. So I just wanted to highlight those as two areas. This bigger bit about us getting a big fund to be able to respond to the needs in the community. I think it is appropriate for us to build up a voice about the particular role of government that is legitimate in this area, which may not be the case in an area like tourism, for example. We are not saying that tourism is not important. We're not saying that people that work in tourism aren't important either, but there is an ongoing understanding there are sort of essential services, and that this is not, philanthropists have a role to play. Those of you who are on the call, you're all there, but there's only so much you can do right now. And I think a collective voice to say there is a particular case for securing some of these essential services into the community is the right kind of message for us to be taking through at the moment. So thanks, Patrick.
Not at all. I'm glad we could get you back online. Thanks, Cass. And thank you for the invitation for people to contact you about those issues. Just letting people know we will run through till 2 o'clock, so you can still post more questions. There are a couple more that people have posted that we will endeavour to answer, but also very happy to take some more questions if you've got more that you want to add. Christy, I might go back to you on this one next. There's a question about mergers in this kind of environment. Obviously, there's a lot of change that's going on, and I'm sure Susie will be happy to answer this one as well, but I might go to you first. Do you think that we should or will be seeing mergers in this environment?
I mean, it's interesting. I think it's probably likely we will see some mergers. We'll probably see some charities just collapse, but we'll also see some mergers. I think the thing about mergers in this space that we have to remember is charities exist for public good. And we have to go back to the purpose and the problem that we're solving for. And so I think that a lot of the thing that's really key here is to make sure that we are clear about, well, what's the purpose that the charity might exist for, which people are really pretty good at knowing, and why does it matter? But then understanding the context that that problem sits within. And so, for example, the context that that sits within in a community location, in a rural or regional location, is very, very different to that problem sitting in a urban or a city area. And there will be particular charities who have particular expertise to offer a service in a better way than somebody else might in another location. And we've seen with things like the NDIS where you see thin markets and the consequences of that if you then get the wrong service provider providing a service because it's not a viable model. So we have to be careful that, nobody knows the answer of how many charities should we have. I think it becomes dangerous to just lose charities because we can't fund them, but we definitely have to look at what problem are we solving for? Do we understand the problem in the context that's based in? And then who should actually be fixing that problem and who plays what roles and how might those roles work together? And in some cases, it might be a merger and acquisition. In other cases, it could be a collaboration. There might be duplication. In some cases, it could be the sharing of IP. It could be the sharing of resources. We might share research expertise. We might share evaluation methods. We might share computer tech. And tech is one of the big areas of infrastructure that we really need to help the sector lift on, because they haven't had money just to often spend it on. So I think we have to be careful with the M&A space to just make sure that we don't restructure for the sake of restructuring because we're driven by the finances. We have to be driven by, well, what problems are we solving for? How do we understand those problems, in what locations, and how do we then best go about that? And in other locations, it may be a big NGO or one that's more financially viable coming in to support a smaller one, as opposed to that then having to be a merger and acquisition. For example, a few years ago, I've done like dozens of evaluations over many decades, but a few years ago, there was a classic example of a big not-for-profit absorbing a Indigenous community not-for-profit in a particular location, and that was a disaster for those particular people that was serving. But in another location under the same funding model, there was a similar thing happen where a big not-for-profit came in and put a whole lot of their infrastructure resources to support another Indigenous community organisation. That community organisation was made viable because of that infrastructure that sat underneath them. They provided the services, and the outcomes for the people they were serving were fantastic as a result. So there are various ways, I think, that we can look at this.
Thanks, Christy. And I think such an important point at this juncture to remind people also about the importance of Aboriginal community control organisations, and so that whilst it is important to talk about efficiencies and about the opportunity to maximise impact, that recognising that there are some services which are going to be uniquely placed to work with the community that they're seeking to serve. And so that we can't assume that just having less charities is going to be a more effective way to deliver services, particularly for Aboriginal community controlled organisations. And it's one we need to be alive to. Susie, as you know, obviously SVA spends a lot of time talking to lots of different not-for-profits and charities. I wonder about what your thoughts are on what are the opportunities for tighter partnerships, or where there are mergers that might take place, or what other partnerships do you think, based on the many different charities that we've worked with over the years, where we think there are opportunities?
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, SVA has been involved with a number of endeavours for mergers and collaborations, and I'll say up front, a lot of them haven't gone through. It's really hard to find organisations that truly are aligned on impact, aligned on the objectives of those who are responsible for governance, and have the resources to go through with all of the processes that are required for a merger or even a collaboration. But where it has worked is where it is very much impact-led. And it starts with what kind of impact could we have collectively that is limited when we are operating separately. And it doesn't start with, gee, wouldn't it be a good idea to merge so that we have fewer partners or fewer grantees. It starts with the impact question. And it doesn't always lead to a merger, as you said, Christy. It could lead to a collaboration. I think the areas that Christy listed are the right ones that we will see opportunities in, around the sharing of IP, technology, collaboration about monitoring and evaluation. Those kinds of areas are ripe for change across a lot of different sectors in Australia, and where organisations can be part of enabling collaborations, or where funders could provide that space plus resources in order to do that, I think we will start to see change. But I don't think it will happen automatically, because leadership teams and boards are so busy trying to keep their heads above water and deal with the crisis that we just modelled in a few graphs for you. I don't think most are yet at the point where they are, head above parapet, gee, who could we merge with in order to have better impact? They're still in, what's our financial outlook going to look like, and are we having the impact that we need to have just for right now, and are we financially solvent? So I think it will come, but it's a little way off still, probably, for most organisations.
Just a couple of comments on that too. I think that's right. I think in the general sense, employers and workers are in a bit of a state of, being very conservative, trying to get a better line of sight of what might be around short-term and longer-term corners. So I think, Susie, that's right. I wouldn't underestimate, though, that there is, of course, a potential for certain parts of government to seize on this sort of efficiencies line as sort of old thinking, that in the absence of something else, they're going to come back to say, well, we've just got to do more with less again. I think this is a key moment, particularly given we've got this really serious health crisis that has not left us at all, to be asserting again the protective role that well-embedded community-controlled community and charitable organisations play in being glue, social glue in the community, that this is not a time to be, kind of going into even further kind of corporatized approaches, but that really high value in being social services, community glue. So please stay with that argument. We will continue to be making that argument. I think at the moment where we've got extraordinary leadership from First Nations organisations about closing the gap, and a very strong push again, Patrick, as you know, to say you have to work in partnership with community-driven approaches, we should again assert that rather than going into kind of the, efficiencies line. I don't underestimate how much pressure there'll be to do more of that. In an appropriate way, we should all be, as we always are, creatively thinking about how we can do things better together. So let's see what happens with that on the upside. Thanks.
Thanks, Cass. There was a specific question that from a little earlier on, I just wanted to return to because that Christy will be able to talk to us about, which was about how the research aligns with the findings of some of the other work that's being done, including the Productivity Commission recommendations about the role of community services. So Christy, I might throw that one to you.
Thanks, Patrick, and great question, Joe. Look, I mean, that's really important. And I think one of the interesting things about the Productivity Commission reports, Royal Commission reports that we've seen across multiple times and many decades is they are only as useful as their implementation. And so one of the challenges is we're not seeing the recommendations actually implemented. And so we see the repeat reports of that. As part of our Build Back Better piece, we are doing a piece of work in partnership with the Community Services Industry Association around looking at past Productivity Commission reports and Royal Commission reports and saying, well, how do we stand on the shoulders of giants who've done amazing amounts of work before? There've been hundreds of people and organisations who fed into these reviews, and we have some incredible recommendations. So what we're doing is pulling together those recommendations and saying, well, what do they tell us in the big picture area, and what can we take from that around pitching that to the Build Back Better piece? And that's sort of one piece to the puzzle around the research work that CSI is doing on how do we look at the pulse of the for-purpose sector and how do we build back better. And so this piece of research in collaboration with SVA, and hopefully we'll do more pieces of work to extend this to answer some of the future questions with SVA and others, we will be releasing a survey in July to the question that's been asked around, well, what does this mean for different sectors or different subgroups? What does this look like outside of community service organisations? We're going to be releasing a big survey in July and start to track this longitudinally. We can marry that up to the ACNC data, but as you all know, it only tells us so much, and people ask us questions and we all go, oh yeah, we can't answer that because the ACNC data doesn't quite get us there. So what we're trying to do is say, how do we better understand the capacity of organisations to respond and to meet their purpose, and how do we know how they're faring over time? So watch this space, it's coming, and I'm pretty excited about that work of pulling together all the Productivity Commission and other Royal Commission recommendations too.
That will be, oh, sorry, yeah.
Patrick, it's Kat here. Just I thought, oh, maybe I won't even mention this because it's not good news, it's bad news stuff. And it's getting, towards Friday afternoon. But I guess we can't ignore the equal remuneration order context for those are affected by it. And again, it just if anybody on this webinar is actively involved in looking at that, just to assure you, we are, along with our state and territory colleagues, the COSs, pushing very hard with Minister Ruston, who is coordinating that work across government. This is the fact that we've got only appropriations in terms of government funding to cover the cost of increased wages from the equal remuneration order booked in the budget until 30th of June next year. So there's actually that version of a funding cliff that's yet to be fixed. So that's a further, in the sort of broader context of research for all of those who are looking at these issues, just to encourage you to try and pull that out. Because, yes, this is a very feminised workforce. The question, Carolyn, thank you, of, is the government listening to it? I think they're listening to it, but are they doing anything about it yet? Well, we have not got anything. And so this is a time, I think, for female leadership to be strongly asserting that stance, because we do know from past bitter experience that feminised workforces trade off their own wages for the services because they're often very committed to what they do. And in the last GFC, the end result of that picture, without going into all the numbers, was it was wealthier white men who did pretty well in the end, and it was lower income women and children from diverse backgrounds who didn't. And so I think just to highlight that we've got to keep having that kind of analysis. So whenever there's been research being done as appropriate, to enable that disaggregation is always really useful to our friends at CSI and SVA as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Cass. And there are a couple of threads there I want to pick up. They're also related to a couple of questions in the chat. So I might sort of do those sort of sequentially. And Christy, I've got one follow-up for you also on the survey that I think would be useful for this group to know what they can do. But just the question particularly about the feminised nature of the workforce for charities, and obviously that's even more so in some subsectors, including the community sector, where, as you said, Cass, it's around 80%. I guess one of the questions was about what sort of response we've got from government, and Cass has obviously shared a little bit about what her response was from Minister Ruston. What I would say is that in the conversations that CSI and SVA have been having, it's also something we've raised, both in terms of people recognising that the disproportionate impact of the COVID crisis so far has fallen on women and young people as another group. And yet a lot of the stimulus measures that have been announced very, old school traditional infrastructure and building programs where we still also have very gendered workforce, but split the other way. And so it's certainly a point that that we have made and that we've raised in the sessions that we have run. I don't know, maybe I'm being a little too optimistic, but I do feel like the media has also started to pick up on the fact that it looks quite unequal, the way that the Commonwealth has been putting its spending. And so, without wanting to jinx it, I do feel like they may come under quite a lot of pressure from a wider spread groups around that issue particularly. But Cass, recognising that, yes, the equal remuneration order specifically as well has a very particular financial impact on the sector. And so that's also, in terms of properly funding the services that are there, that's clearly a very important point to make sure that that cliff, that we don't get to that cliff as well. Christy, just in terms of follow up on the survey, obviously a good one for us to take offline about what some of those subsplits might be, to Cass's points about what other things we can pull out. But I also just wanted to ask you that with this group of people on the call, what you would hope that people would do. I know that you haven't been, we're not yet at the point where the survey's out, so people can't fill it in yet, but whether or not you had a particular ask or request from people on this call about the survey. Certainly, we're desperately hoping that we get as many people to participate as possible so we can get a good panel data set, a good longitudinal data set to be able to do this kind of analysis in more detail. But is there something else you would want from the group?
I think for now, yeah, when it comes out, share it as widely as you can with your networks, and us encourage people to complete it. It has been based off a survey that we've been running for the last few years for disability providers who have been disrupted by the NDIS. And so we've been getting every year around 700 respondents to that particular survey. We really want this one to be much greater than that sample size, and for it to be vast across different issue areas and the way that different people are funded. So not just to include obviously charities, not-for-profits, but also social enterprises, corporate foundations. And we really want to get a good understanding of the for-purpose sector, because there are lots of people who play in this space. And going back to understanding the ecosystem is really important. I think we've desperately needed a longitudinal data set for a really long time, because we've only ever been able to get snapshot understandings. The ACNC data is useful for a whole bunch of things, but it only takes us so far. So the more people we can get in that, the better. We're also looking at deep dives. So we are interested in any areas that people desperately want us to dig into more deeply. We are starting a couple of deep dives, one in the area of homelessness that my colleague Paul Flatow is running out of CSI University of Western Australia, but with our people across networks and with a whole bunch of collaborators in industry. And we're looking we haven't announced this yet, but we're about to do one that some of our Indigenous colleagues are leading across our networks. And it's really all about how do we do more around, you know, the value piece, the language piece, how have they pivoted, responded in COVID, and how do we draw on the strengths of our Indigenous community and leaders in terms of how that might help inform us as to what happens next. But that's coming pretty soon. So if anyone's interested in a particular deep dive area that you want us to explore, we'd love to hear from you.
And can I just add, I've just put in the chat here, we're very conscious, which is great, that there is a lot of new findings coming through, a lot of data analysis happening. These are vital bodies of evidence as we continue to try and lift up our advocacy and collective efforts. What we're right now doing is playing a monitoring role and trying to, again, get repeat cut through with key ministers at federal level about what's coming through. So we've brought through these findings from this survey already through to Frydenberg and other key ministers in what we're calling the Taking the Temperature. It's a resource for all of you. If any of you want it, it's on our ACOS website, but it's we're not doing the original research on a lot of this stuff. We're just saying this is the most important stuff, backbenchers, don't miss it. So we're trying to sort of synthesise some of that. So if there's anything that you would like us to include in this Taking the Temperature, so, you know, it's only a few pages, but we're sending it regularly to all the backbenchers. Email Edwina. I've put in the chat. Thank you, everybody, and congratulations, hard work from you know, CSI and SVA here, and really great to be participating this afternoon. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Cass. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just looking. I don't think there are any more questions on the chat that I haven't answered. I think we've got to most of those. One thing, I guess there are a couple of other things that I had that are on the list that I know that people have asked regularly. One, of course, is that we did this analysis on JobKeeper prior to the announcement from the government that indeed they'd made a $60 billion rounding error, if I can call it that, in terms of the number of people and the amount of money that was going to be spent on JobKeeper. You will see that we have done other scenarios to look at a lower level of application to JobKeeper to the sample size, but we are hoping to get some better data from our friends at the Australian Tax Office as to what the actual numbers are around charities who have signed up and are participating in JobKeeper, so that we can do some more refined analysis, because obviously that would be very helpful to us. So I know that's another one that people have regularly asked. You are, of course, very welcome to follow up with us. I think Rhonda's put the CSI marketing email address up on the chat at the end there. I think she's hopefully also going to drop my email address onto that chat now, so that if you had further questions that you wanted to ask us or things that you wanted to follow up with, then please feel free to get in touch with CSI or with SVA about the report. And certainly, if you have questions for Christy or you want to know more or suggest some deep dives for the research, please also get in touch with her. Finally, I will let Susie and Christy give a kind of a last comment for the day and have the last word. But as you know, as someone who worked very closely with Cassie McGannon and with Iona at CSI and others in order to get this piece of work together, which we hope is incredibly useful to people, I would also stress that we're also looking for support, both of our organisations, to try and do more analysis. And we would very much like to do more cuts of the data and to be able to do more work on these things. And we are ourselves both charities, so you know we rely on the support of people, including people on this call, for which we're incredibly grateful, in order to be able to do this kind of analysis on behalf of the whole sector. But Susie, I might go to you first, and then Christy, I'll give you the final word.
Thanks, Patrick. Thank you, everyone, for caring so deeply about this and being part of the good cause. I think most of the things that have already been said by some of the other speakers. We're here to be helpful. So if there's people you think we should get in front of, if there's people that you think will be influential that we can share this with, that we can do more work with, then please let us know. It's obviously great to have the opportunities to share this with decision makers, but it's not done until we start to see some of the recommendations being implemented. So we need your help and we want to be helpful if we can. Thanks.
Thanks. Conscious of time, thank you for joining us for this webinar. We absolutely want our charities to be partners in recovery, not COVID casualties. The cost socially, economically, health-wise is far too great, and the investment is so beneficial. And as Patrick just says, we have a spare $60 billion to invest. So let's get to it, shall we? Have a great afternoon and happy weekend, everybody. Thanks for joining us at another Impact 2020 webinar. Bye.